Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to explore the core ideas shaping our world. And today, we're diving into Matt Taibbi's book, The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap.
Yeah, it's a really provocative read.
It is. Our aim here is to unpack his central argument, this idea that the American justice system operates fundamentally differently for the rich and powerful compared to, well, the poor and vulnerable.
And it's not just a small difference he's talking about. Taibbi presents this really startling statistical anomaly right at the beginning.
That's the one that grabs you, Brad.
Absolutely. So get this. From the 1990s, poverty in the U.S. actually went up pretty sharply, like from around 10% to over 15% by 2010.
Okay, poverty up.
But, and here's the twist, violent crime went down significantly.
Right, which you'd maybe think is good news overall, less crime.
You would think. But then the prison population, it more than doubled in roughly the same period. Went from about 1 million in 91 to over 2.2 million by 2012.
Wow. So less crime, more poverty, way more people in prison. That just doesn't, it doesn't track logically, does it?
It really doesn't. I mean, Taibbi puts it starkly. More people in the U.S. justice system today, that's jail, prison, parole, probation, around 6 million, than were ever in Stalin's gulags.
That's a shocking comparison.
And he adds another one. More black men in the system now than were enslaved at slavery's peak. It just, as he says, doesn't fit unless you bring in an alternative explanation.
And that alternative explanation is the divide.
That's the core thesis. A hidden systemic split in American justice. Put simply, some people go to jail and others just don't.
And he argues this starts because the problem itself is often invisible.
Exactly, and an invisible problem.
Yeah.
He suggests that if you're well off, you probably have, very little concept of how easily poorer folks can get tangled up in the system for relatively minor things.
And the flip side.
Conversely, if you're maybe struggling, you don't see the sheer scale of what he calls awesome criminal capers that the powerful and politically connected can get away with.
It's hidden unless you specifically look for it.
Right. Basically invisible, he says.
So where does he start looking? What's a key example?
He points to the prosecution of Abacus Federal Savings Bank back in 2013. This was, incredibly rare.
How rare?
It was the only time a bank was criminally prosecuted anywhere in America after the 2008 financial crisis. The only one. And apparently the first since the early 90s.
The only one. Okay, so what was special about Abacus? Were they the worst offenders?
Well, that's the thing. The defendants weren't, millionaire CEOs. They were mostly Chinese immigrants, low-level loan officers at this small community bank in Chinatown.
Not exactly Wall Street titans.
Not at all. And the misconduct itself was described as highly idiosyncratic, specific to that immigrant community. It wasn't even tied to the big subprime mortgage meltdown that caused the 2008 crisis.
So a small bank, local issues, low-level employees.
Yeah.
How did that compare to the big players involved in the crisis?
Well, the defense lawyer, Sam Talkin, hammered this point. He argued selective prosecution. He listed the big banks. Citigroup settled for nearly $1 billion. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Ally, JP Morgan Chase, they settled for billions each.
Billions. For practices related to the crisis, right? Like bad home loans.
Exactly. Underperforming or defaulted home loans. But crucially, those were all civil settlements. No criminal charges, no arrests for the individuals running those banks.
And Abacus.
With Abacus, the state couldn't even point to a single dollar of loss resulting from their specific loan issues.
So zero proven loss for Abacus, facing criminal charges.
Yeah.
Billions in losses linked to the big banks, and they just pay fines.
That's the picture Taibbi paints. He describes Talkin practically begging the judge, Judge White, to explain the logic, why his clients, causing no loss, were facing prison while the others weren't.
And the judge's response.
She dismissed the comparisons as extraneous matters, said she was tired.
Tired? Wow. But Taibbi wasn't tired of the question.
No, he says he spent years chasing that fundamental question. Why do some go to jail and others walk for the same thing? And Abacus became, for him, the symbol of this.
The symbol of being small enough to jail.
Precisely. Officially deemed small enough to destroy. It's the flip side of too big to fail.
Yeah.
And this thinking, Taibbi argues, ties back to policy, specifically something called the Collateral Consequences doctrine.
Collateral consequences, what's that about?
It stems from a 1999 memo by Eric Holder, who later became Attorney General. The memo suggested prosecutors could, and maybe should, consider the wider impact of criminally charging a corporation.
What kind of impact?
Things like, harm to innocent employees, shareholders, the broader economy if the company collapses. The memo proposed looking at other forms of justice instead.
Like fines and settlements.
Exactly. Fines, civil sanctions, deferred prosecutions deals where charges are dropped if the company behaves for a while.
So you could argue there's a logic there, right?
Yeah.
Avoiding massive job losses, economic disruption.
Sure, and Taibbi acknowledges that argument gained real traction after the Arthur Andersen case. The accounting firm, remember? Tied up in the Enron scandal.
Vaguely, yeah. What happened there?
They were hit with just one felony count related to obstruction of justice. The firm basically vaporized almost overnight. 28,000 jobs gone. Poof.
Okay, that's definitely collateral damage.
Huge damage. And Taibbi says government officials quietly recoiled from what happened. Then the Supreme Court actually overturned the conviction later, and the DOJ dropped it. It set a powerful precedent.
Don't kill a company.
That became the implicit message, yeah. Fear of another Arthur Andersen. And you saw it almost immediately.
How so?
In 2005, the accounting firm KPMG faced a massive tax shelter fraud investigation. But unlike Andersen, KPMG was not criminally indicted as a firm.
They got one of those deals.
A deferred prosecution agreement, yeah. And a $456 million penalty. But interestingly, 19 individuals from KPMG were indicted.
So charge the people, not the company.
That was maybe the idea, but it got messy. KPMG tried to limit legal fee payments for employees unless they cooperated fully with the government.
Squeezing their own people.
That's how Judge Lewis Kaplan saw it. He threw out the indictments for 13 of those individuals, citing their Sixth Amendment right to counsel. He blasted the DOJ's tactics, which were based on guidelines influenced by that Holder memo, sometimes called the Thompson memo by then.
So the effort to hold individuals accountable also hit roadblocks. What was the trend after that?
Huge spike in these non-prosecution agreements, MPAs, and deferred prosecution agreements, DPAs. Taibbi cites the numbers, only 5 in 2004, but jumping to 41 by 2007.
Wow. And the money involved.
Skyrocketed. Fines went from maybe a few $100 million in 2008 to billions in the years right after, over $5 billion in 2009 alone.
So lots of money changing hands, deals being cut. But did this translate into individual accountability at the top, especially during the Obama administration, with Holder as AG?
Well, Taibbi argues that the DOJ under Holder and Lanny Breuer, head of the criminal division, really leaned into this corporate lawyer mindset. They came from big law firms themselves.
And the attitude was?
Risk avoidance above all, Taibbi writes. Micromanaging cases, a real reluctance to bring any case they weren't absolutely sure they could win. Some career prosecutors apparently called them tourists.
Did this have tangible effects on cases?
Taibbi points to the Ted Stevens case. He was a Republican senator from Alaska. New political appointees at DOJ allegedly interfered, held back evidence favorable to Stevens, things like FBI interview notes, the 302s.
Evidence that could have cleared him.
Potentially, yes. His conviction was ultimately thrown out because of prosecutorial misconduct. But Taibbi says it left career prosecutors feeling unsupported, even scared.
And what about the big fish from the financial crisis itself, like Angelo Mozillo at Countrywide?
Mozillo. Taibbi calls him the living, spray-tan symbol of corruption from the subprime mess. He made almost $500 million. There were emails where he called his own mortgage products toxic.
Seems like a prime target for prosecution.
You'd think. But Taibbi reports he was quietly informed by the DOJ that he was not a target for criminal prosecution.
Just not a target. Meanwhile,
Taibbi contrasts this with the intense, multi-year pursuit of baseball player Roger Clemens for allegedly lying to Congress about steroid use.
Right, I remember that case.
The government threw dozens of agents and lawyers at it, Taibbi says, and they lost. A former prosecutor is quoted saying that kind of high-profile loss makes you hesitate before tackling something complex and maybe less flashy, like a credit default swap case.
So the logic isn't just about preventing companies from collapsing. It's also about avoiding tough, risky, politically sensitive cases.
That's Taibbi's argument, avoiding cases that are politically embarrassing, costly in manpower and resources, or just plain difficult. The imperative became never wanted to lose, ever.
Even when facing what he calls the biggest white-collar crime wave in American history.
Which was, of course, the 2008 financial crisis itself. He describes it as just systemic fraud. These magic mortgage bonds. Bundles of risky loans sold as safe investments.
Leading to millions unable to pay.
Millions. He doesn't mince words. A Ponzi scheme, no different than the Bernie Madoff caper, only executed on an exponentially huger scale.
And the signs of fraud were everywhere.
He details some crazy stuff. Countrywide's internal policy, FUNDEM, basically lend to anyone. Then you had these corporate phantoms like Linda Green, a name supposedly signed on thousands of foreclosure documents, but in 22 different handwriting styles.
22? Seriously?
That's what the book claims. And then there was the MERS system, the Mortgage Electronic Registration System,
What was that?
a private database created by Wall Street banks to track mortgage ownership transfers electronically, bypassing the traditional county clerk recording systems.
Why bypass the counties?
To save money. Untold millions, Taibbi says, in local registration fees that were legally required for each transfer. It also made it harder to track who actually owned the mortgage.
Convenient for the banks.
Very. And Taibbi notes that Covington and Burling, the law firm Eric Holder worked at before and after being AG, had written legal opinions saying MERS was perfectly legal.
So mountains of evidence, blatant fraud, but prosecutions.
Almost nobody with any connection to the crisis was even threatened with criminal prosecution, Taibbi writes. He claims it was a deliberate strategy.
Deliberate? Why?
He cites reports that Tim Geithner, then Treasury Secretary, believed that fully exposing the fraud would create financial panics. So essentially, they hushed it up to save the system.
Which circles back perfectly to the Abacus Bank case.
Exactly. The tiny bank, self-reported issue, no systemic risk, immigrant employees. They become the sole post-crisis criminal prosecution of a bank. Small enough to jail.
Taibbi also uses the Lehman Brothers collapse as a case study, right? More invisible crime.
Yeah, he paints Lehman's collapse as this incredibly complex shell game. Executives like Dick Fuld and Joe Gregory racked up $700 billion in debt, then quietly sucked the cash out before the bankruptcy, leaving everyone else holding the bag.
And Lehman's strategy leading up to it was desperate.
He calls it a junkie's banking strategy, borrowing massive amounts, like $100, $200 billion a day in these super short-term overnight repo loans just to keep the lights on.
Repo loans. Those are secured, right, with collateral.
Yes, that becomes crucial later. And remember, the government famously didn't bail out Lehman, unlike others. Taibbi sees this as cementing America's status as a permanent oligarchical bailout state. Some get saved, some don't, based on connections and perceived systemic importance.
But the real kicker is what happened during the bankruptcy sale.
Oh yeah, Lehman's last crooked trade, Taibbi calls it. With CEO Dick Fuld gone, remaining execs allegedly cut a secret deal with Barclays, the bank buying Lehman's core asset.
A secret deal? How?
There were two deals. A public one that looked fair, and a secret pre-dawn deal where key Lehman insiders got millions in bonuses from Barclays, essentially, to jigger the numbers, and ensure Barclays got a much better deal than publicly disclosed.
The Lehman board didn't know.
Never told, according to Taibbi. The secret involves something called a clarification letter related to those repo loan agreements.
The ones using collateral.
Right. This letter essentially allowed Barclays to claim billions estimates range from $5 to $7 billion in excess collateral that Lehman had posted for those overnight loans. Basically, free money for Barclays taken from Lehman's carcass.
And this came out later.
Lehman's creditors, like the city of Long Beach, sued to reopen the sale when they found out. Taibbi says witnesses in court were remarkably candid about this audacious asset grab.
But did the court undo it?
No. Judge Peck denied relief. Taibbi argues the judge effectively legitimized the secret deal by acting as if the clarification letter had been properly approved, even though it hadn't been part of the original sale agreement he reviewed.
Just let it stand.
That's the account. And on top of all this, Taibbi throws in another detail about Tim Geithner knowing about the LIBOR interest rate rigging scandal way back in 2008, but not telling the DOJ, saying they could read about it in the papers.
The sheer audacity is something, which leads to this idea Taibbi calls the sophistication defense.
Yeah, it's this notion that on Wall Street, lying for profit is almost excused if your counterparty is deemed sophisticated. The idea is, if you're dealing with the big boys, you should be smart enough to know they might try to screw you.
Like the Goldman Sachs guys calling clients Muppets.
Exactly. Taibbi notes Goldman's lawyers used the word sophisticated dozens of times defending one particular deal, implying the investors should have been sophisticated enough to look out for that sort of thing. It shifts blame away from the perpetrator.
And this mindset, he argues, permeates even everyday consumer finance. like credit cards.
He describes Chase's credit card business, for instance, as functioning almost like a gigantic welfare fraud scheme.
How so?
Banks borrow money super cheap from the Fed, lend it out at high interest rates on credit cards, and then make a huge chunk of their profit from fees and lawsuits when people default.
Fees and lawsuits, more than interest.
That's what a former Chase VP, Linda Almonte, claimed. A $5,000 debt could easily become a $13,000 or $14,000 with all the penalties. They make more on lawsuits than they make on credit interest, she said.
And how do they win those lawsuits so easily?
Through practices like robo-signing, bank employees signing affidavits swearing to facts in debt collection cases without actually reviewing the files, notaries stamping stacks of documents without the signer present, just pushing paper.
Linda Almonte blew the whistle on this.
She did. As a VP overseeing loan sales, she found that maybe 50–60% of the accounts in a massive portfolio Chase was selling as judgments didn't actually have the proper court judgment paperwork.
What happened when she raised the alarm?
She got fired,
Yeah.
and Chase apparently went ahead and sold the portfolio of 23,000 accounts anyway.
Unbelievable. And there are other tricks.
Yeah, gutter service or sewer service. Process servers hired to deliver court summonses just dumping them instead, maybe because they're paid so little, like $4 a pop. Then they file fake affidavits saying they served the papers.
So people don't even know they're being sued.
Often not, which leads to automatic default judgments. Plus, Taibbi describes a paperwork scam where banks deliberately sell debt portfolios with incomplete files, forcing the debt buyer to pay the original bank extra for the necessary documents to actually pursue the case in court.
It sounds like a system rigged at multiple levels. Any pushback?
Very little systemically. Taibbi highlights one judge in Staten Island, Judge Strenier, as a rare anomaly. He actually paused a bunch of debt collection cases because he noticed issues like robo-signing and the debt buyer company not even being registered to business in New York.
Just one judge.
Seemingly the only one making waves on that specific issue at the time. And Linda Almonte, the whistleblower, she filed a formal complaint with the SEC in late 2010.
Did anything come of it?
A year later, the SEC apparently told her they had no record of her complaint. And by May 2012, Taibbi notes the SEC admitted it hadn't paid out a single award under its new whistleblower program, despite getting lots of tips.
So we're back to that same paradox. Huge settlements for the company's Chase paid over $16 billion total for various crisis-related issues, but individuals.
Individuals largely walk. Taibbi's conclusion on this side is stark. There's always just enough evidence to extract hundreds of millions or even billions in fines, but somehow not quite enough evidence to force any individual to do so much as a day in jail.
Okay, so that's one side of the divide. Let's cross over. What does justice for the vulnerable look like in Taibbi's analysis? The small enough to jail reality.
He starts with the welfare system, specifically a program in San Diego called P100, where incredibly welfare applicants could have their homes searched preemptively before even being approved for aid.
Searched without a warrant.
Essentially, yeah. The logic, Taibbi says, was this weird idea that being poor somehow reduces your rights, your dignity.
He gives examples, right?
Disturbing ones.
I-
A caseworker poking through an underwear drawer with a pencil, accusing a woman of hiding a man because there were 2 toothbrushes, inspecting stuffed animals in a crib. Highly invasive.
Was this legal?
It was challenged in court, Rocio Sanchez v. San Diego County. But the legal precedent went back to a 1971 Supreme Court case, Wyman v. James, which basically ruled that Fourth Amendment warrant requirements didn't fully apply to home visits for welfare recipients.
So the court said it was okay.
The implication, Taibbi argues, was that poor, often minority, mothers like Barbara James in the original case had fewer constitutional protections if they accepted government help.
The contrast he draws is jarring.
Extremely, he puts it bluntly. $26 billion of bank fraud. No felony cases. But when the stakes are in the hundreds of dollars for welfare, we kick in 26,000 doors a year in just one county.
And this creates a whole poverty bureaucracy.
Right. Welfare caseworkers were literally retrained as fraud investigators, sometimes working in the same offices. Applicants would unknowingly be talking to someone whose job was to catch them out.
And the penalties for welfare fraud.
Often disproportionately harsh, especially for smaller amounts. Lying about cash aid might get you up to 3 years, but lying about food stamps could carry up to 20 years under federal law.
20 years for food stamps.
Potentially. And then there's the public shaming. He describes how Riverside County, California, actually published the names and photos of people convicted of welfare fraud mostly women of color in the local newspaper.
Like the stocks of old.
Exactly. They don't do this to rapists or murderers, he points out.
This intense scrutiny extends to street crime too, right? He uses a story, Andrew Brown.
Yeah, Andrew Brown's story illustrates what Taibbi calls justice by attrition. Growing up in heavily policed Brooklyn projects, Andrew is constantly getting arrested for minor stuff.
Like what?
Things like observation sales. Police see someone hand something to someone else, assume it's drugs, make an arrest, even if they don't find any drugs on the person. Just the observation is enough for the initial charge.
So you can be arrested for looking suspicious.
Effectively, yeah. Andrew spent years in and out of Rikers Island, mostly fighting these low-level charges, just trying to survive the system.
And the police tactics described sound pretty aggressive.
Taibbi calls it accidental crime fighting. Basically, sweep up every fish in the pond, hoping some charges stick, and throw back the ones they couldn't. Undercover cops driving anything, grabbing people off the street, maybe macing someone for loitering.
What happens if the police make a bad arrest? Are there consequences for the officers?
Usually not personally. If there's a lawsuit, the city, meaning taxpayers, pays the settlement. Taibbi says the officers involved typically aren't even informed of it.
So no feedback loop for bad policing.
Seems not. And the core mechanism for the poor, Taibbi argues, is bail. The punishment is the process.
How does bail function as punishment?
For misdemeanors, bail is often set low, but still just high enough that poor people can't afford it. So they sit in jail for weeks or months, just waiting for their case to resolve.
Even if they're innocent or the charges are weak.
Right. In New York, he found the average wait time in jail for those who couldn't make misdemeanor bail was 15 days. That affected over 16,000 people a year. Lose your job, your housing, all while presumed innocent.
Andrew Brown's experiences in court sound Kafkaesque.
Totally. Charged with obstructing pedestrian traffic at 1 a.m. on a deserted street, right outside his own home, wearing his work clothes and ID. His own public defender couldn't understand why he wouldn't just plead guilty to make it go away.
Just plead guilty to get out.
That's the pressure. Compare that, Taibbi says, to the executives in the January insurance fraud case, a $600 million scheme. They got sentences like 1-2 years, often suspended while they appealed.
While stealing a car?
Car theft, grand larceny can get you up to 15 years. As one public defender put it, car thefts, they do those by the book.
This pattern of harsh enforcement for the vulnerable extends to immigration too.
Definitely. Policies like Section 287G and secure communities effectively turned local police into immigration agents. Fingerprint checks became standard for anyone arrested for anything.
Eating too.
Dragnet enforcement, police checkpoints in immigrant neighborhoods, arrests and deportations triggered by minor things, a broken taillight, fishing without a license.
Fishing without a license got someone deported.
Taibbi tells the story of Sua Castro, married to a U.S. citizen, deported for that. Driving without a license was another huge trigger.
And what rights do undocumented immigrants have in this process?
Very few, according to Taibbi. They're treated less like prisoners with rights than like objects or packages. Immigration proceedings are civil, not criminal, so constitutional protections like the Fourth Amendment are weaker. Evidence only gets thrown out for egregious violations.
He shares stories here too, right? Ella and Alvaro.
Yeah. Ella, a doctor who fled violence in Mexico, got arrested for driving without a license after a minor accident. She fought her deportation and eventually got status. Alvaro, a Colombian immigrant, was swept up, sent to a private prison run by CCA with exorbitant prices for phone calls and basic items.
Alvaro's story ends badly.
Horrifically. He was deported to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, a place he'd never been. Within hours, he was kidnapped by the Zetas cartel, who were apparently monitoring phone calls from the hotel where newly deported migrants were sent.
My God. Is there any awareness of the negative impacts of these policies, even from a business perspective?
Taibbi mentions a chicken processing executive in Georgia complaining to the state Senate that 287G was bad for business. It increased employee turnover, workers' comp claims, healthcare costs.
Did that change anything?
It maybe gave police a little leeway to be merciful, Taibbi suggests, but often it just meant more arrests and fines, not necessarily fewer deportations. He calls it a white folks win-win. Businesses kept access to cheap labor, while the state could still milk immigrant communities for fine revenue.
He tells another story, Natividad in Los Angeles.
Yes, her husband was deported. She kept losing her car to 30-day impounds and facing huge fees like $1,400 each time just for driving without a license, which she needed to get to work.
Couldn't she get a license?
The laws kept changing, making it impossible for undocumented immigrants. She ended up doing community service because she couldn't pay the fines. And tragically, taxi companies wouldn't even come to her gang-heavy neighborhood at night when her child was sick.
It's just layer upon layer of difficulty. Now, Taibbi argues this kind of profiling isn't just limited to traditional minority groups anymore.
Right. He tells the story of Patrick Jewell, a white middle-class musician in Brooklyn.
What happened now?
He was brutally beaten by undercover police. They apparently mistook his hand-rolled tobacco cigarette for marijuana, tackled him, beat him up, and then charged him with tampering with evidence, the cigarette.
And uniformed officers.
One arrived but refused to intervene, just watched. Patrick ended up with PTSD. Taibbi uses this to show how the definition of who is an appropriate target for police harassment seems to be widening.
And this expansion also happens on the white-collar side.
Yeah.
Against smaller businesses.
Yes. Once the truly too big to jail banks like HSBC, Barclays, Goldman were effectively firewalled from criminal prosecution, Taibbi argues, regulatory scrutiny intensified on everyone else, the giant subset of all other businesses. Pressure on agencies like the SEC to show they were doing something, to meet enforcement quotas. So they started looking at everyone else's books far more closely. He even mentions them padding stats by filing actions against zombie firms that were already defunct.
So if you can't nail the big guys, go after the smaller ones to make your numbers look good.
That's the dynamic Taibbi describes.
Okay, bringing it all together, what's Taibbi's final conclusion about this divide? What does it all add up to?
He concludes that these inequities aren't just accidental, they've been internalized into the very structure of our society. A vast system of increasingly unmanageable bureaucracies, both public and private.
Driven by what?
By a burning hatred of all losers and the poor, he writes, coupled with a breathless, abject worship of the rich. It creates this giant brainless machine for creating social inequity.
A machine that just automatically
Keeps the poor poor, sucks money from the middle class upwards, and fundamentally protects money above people. He says the system basically hates all people.
And the two sides of the justice system, lenient for the rich, harsh for the poor, while maybe making some twisted sense individually.
Side by side, he says, they create a dystopia. City courts become factories for turning poor people into prisoners. Federal prosecutors become overpriced garbage men who just quietly dispose of the sins of the rich for a fee.
The lie was all in what was not said. That's a powerful line.
It is. He argues the system pretends to be unified, but it's operating on completely contradictory principles.
Does he trace the political origins of this?
He points significantly to the Bill Clinton era in the 90s. Clinton pushed two major things simultaneously: radical welfare reform, ending welfare as we know it, which put immense scrutiny on the poor, and radical financial deregulation, repealing the Glass-Steagall Act that separated commercial and investment banking, deregulating complex derivatives.
So crack down on the poor, let Wall Street run wild.
That's the effect Taibbi describes. This third way politics allowed Democrats to get Wall Street campaign money while also bashing Black dependency for political points. It created parallel tracks. Immense paperwork and suspicion for the poor, while banks were increasingly encouraged to lend and speculate without filling out any paperwork at all.
What about the prosecutor's defense? That it's just genuinely hard to prove individual intent in these massive corporate fraud cases.
Taibbi acknowledges that excuse is often used. It is hard, but he finds it contradictory. He points to cases like BP traders caught on tape seemingly manipulating energy markets where evidence existed, but the DOJ still couldn't secure convictions or settled for less.
So the difficulty isn't always the real reason.
He suggests the real motivation is often that aversion to losing high-profile, complex, politically charged cases. It leads to a kind of reverse profiling, where investigators go after easier targets, often smaller businesses, rather than tackle the corporate giants.
Which just reinforces the divide all over again.
Exactly.
Wow. This deep dive into Taibbi's The Divide really lays out a disturbing picture. It leaves you, the listener, with a pretty profound question to think about.
Yeah, if this analysis holds, if the justice system at its highest levels really does operate to shield wealth and power while punishing poverty and vulnerability so disproportionately, what does that say about the very idea of justice in America?
How much does fairness and equality under the law truly depend on the size of your bank account? It's a challenging thought to end on.